We all want to make a difference in the world, that much is true, but to do that, we need to set goals. Have you ever set a goal, but had your plan interrupted or sidetracked? And it happens. Maybe it's because you got a little lazy, or you lost focus, or other responsibilities took priority, or you got stuck and weren't sure how to make it happen. There's a guy in the Bible named Nehemiah who understood this really well, because he had a big goal inspired by a really big problem. So Nehemiah set a goal, a God-sized goal, to find a way to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so God's people would be protected and God would be honored. Let's give a little background. The book we're reading is called Nehemiah, written by a guy named...
What is he doing?
Wait for it. Wait for it.
Nehemiah. About 140 years before this book begins, the Jewish people were conquered by an enemy army, and they took control of Jerusalem. They destroyed the city, they burned the temple, and sent many of God's people into exile. Now, even though the prophets relayed God's promise to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and that God's people would return, this loss, this getting booted out of their home, was devastating. And can you imagine what it would be like to be invaded and then kicked out of your own home, or city, or country? You'd likely lose friends and family members in the process. You'd be forced to adopt a new language, new laws, and other things that felt really unusual since they were so new. And for generations, the Jewish people were heartbroken because they lost everything but their lives. Sometime later, some of God's people began to return to Jerusalem, looking for ways to rebuild what they had lost. And Nehemiah had only ever known a Jerusalem occupied by enemy armies, so Nehemiah really wanted to see Jerusalem restored. And he was serving in the government at the time, working for the king. He used his influence to get some good things done. And Nehemiah had a big goal, inspired by an even bigger problem. Nehemiah already knew Jerusalem had been destroyed. That was old news, but when he found out that people were returning to Jerusalem, but the walls were still in shambles, Nehemiah saw a problem. Without walls, God's people would be vulnerable to another attack. But there's also a spiritual problem. You see, the city of Jerusalem was deeply connected with the Jewish people's relationship with God. Location meant a lot to the people's connection to God. They believed that rebuilding the walls would be a way for them to honor God, while leaving them in shambles would be a sin against God. Nehemiah wanted to see the whole nation of Israel return to God, so he set a God-sized goal. Find a way to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that God's people would be protected and would be honored. Jerusalem's troubles birthed in Nehemiah a goal that wouldn't just benefit himself, but would serve his people and his God too. His goal began with difficulty. Nehemiah didn't set this goal because he needed a cool New Year's resolution. He set it because he saw the problem that needed to be solved, and he believed that he could help solve it. It wasn't just a fun hobby, it mattered very deeply to him. His goal began with prayer. As Nehemiah wept, he also fasted and prayed. He knew his goal was so big he couldn't do it all by himself. So before he made a single move, he asked God for wisdom, for guidance and help. His goal began with God's help. Nehemiah stood up from his prayer and fasting, determined to attempt something impossible. He knew his own wisdom and experience weren't enough to guarantee success, so he asked God for help. The size of this goal forced Nehemiah to put all of his faith in a God who could do what Nehemiah couldn't. The book of Nehemiah begins with destruction, loss, grief, and tears, but that's not where this story is going to end. When Nehemiah heard the news about Jerusalem's crumbling walls, he discovered an important truth, that big difficulties can inspire God-sized goals.